Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am coming to you from Wathaurong country in Victoria. Pay my respects to elders past and present in this beautiful area surrounding Ballarat as part of the Kulin Nation. And I would also like to acknowledge that our two guest speakers today are coming from Aranda country in the centre of Australia around Alice Springs. And I pay my respects to your elders past and present as well. And to the elders past and present, for everyone who's joined us today on whatever Aboriginal or Indigenous country you come from, and welcome any First Nations people who have come as participants. So today's a really interesting session, and we are thrilled to be hosting this conversation with Kayla and Chay, and I'll introduce them both in a moment. But before we begin, I'll just do some admin, just in case anyone doesn't know how these webinars work. Forgive me if you've been to hundreds. So we are recording the webinar, and it will be available to all of you to watch and or share on our YouTube channel later this week. We will have automatic captions available. You just have to access them via your Zoom settings, but they're available if you need them. We are meeting in webinar mode. Now, sometimes people meet in a different mode and you can all chat to one another in the chat. We've chosen to use the webinar mode because we'd really like you to be present and give your full attention to the conversation. And we invite you to put questions in the Q&A function. That is live. And at the end of the seminar or towards the end of the seminar, we'll try and make sure we have a conversation about some of your questions. So please feel free at any stage to put questions in that Q&A function and to upvote them in the usual way with ticks and so on for questions you'd really like to have included. And I'll try to go to the most popular questions. Just a little bit of a request about the questions you do put in the Q&A chat. We would like you to be considerate of our speakers and of one another, and so we are asking that you don't provide any graphic or traumatic information in the chat about any of your own experiences or any domestic violence or other experiences of people you know, and try and keep it to a question you'd like our speakers to address. We have provided information about support services. If any of the conversation today does in any way cause you any distress, that we encourage you to get the support and the help that you need. So we've provided that to you as well. Now we're going to dive pretty much straight in because the preparation conversations we've been having together have just been endlessly interesting. So I'll do a very short introduction to our two speakers and then we'll go straight into our first question. So Kayla Glynn-Braun, sorry, I told you I'd get that right and I didn't. Kayla is the co-founder and managing director of Her Story and a proud Wiradjuri woman with deep family ties to the Irambi mission near Cowra in New South Wales. She's based in the Northern Territory and has been for more than a decade and is passionate about supporting First Nations communities and advocating for women's safety, healing and justice. So welcome, Kayla. Dr. Chay Brown is a social scientist, researcher and family violence practitioner with over a decade of experience in the prevention of domestic, family and sexual violence. Born and raised in Mbantua, see, it's live that does it, isn't it? Thank you, that's my best attempt. Alice Springs and the surrounding remote communities, she brings both lived experience and academic expertise to her work. So we don't have an easing in question for audiences to be aware of. We've just decided to jump straight in. And I'm really aware that we want to emphasise the place-specific experiences that are relevant in remote, regional and urban communities in the Northern Territory. And we are having this discussion in the context of disasters, preparedness, response and recovery. I'm really aware, and I have been very guilty of this myself in various roles, that when we think of disasters, we often talk about fire and flood. Sometimes we add cyclone and storm. But today we'd like to give space to two very different conversations that are urgent in the context of the centre and the north of Australia, and that is extreme heat and ecosystem destruction. So we've sort of got a two-part question here about both of those hazards. And Kayla, I wonder if you'd like to kick us off and speak about the extreme heat example to start with.
Thank you so much. And thank you for allowing us to have this really important conversation because normally we don't have these conversations. But yeah, so let's jump straight into it. So, when we talk about extreme heat in the Northern Territory, we're looking at remote communities with no access to aircon. So what we find is aircon, if there is any aircon, the affordability to run an aircon due to running off power cards, which cost a lot more money than it does to run if you are on a cable to the town centre. So we see about 80 to 120% increase. We also see an increase in violence following extreme heat waves. We also see when we're talking about extreme heat, but also floods, access to food resources in remote communities. So whether if the roads are cut off, whether if the planes can get in, yeah, food insecurity is quite extreme, and it can go on for long periods of time. We also are looking at extreme heat waves where people can't access services because it's too hot to walk. So yeah, and travel limitations. We also see isolation, extreme heat waves. What else do we see? We also see animals and that get affected in the extreme heat also.
It's so interesting. And when I have visited the centre,
Mm.
there's this quite dramatic shift between what can be an incredibly hot day and then an incredibly cold night and then back again. So I don't think for any of the listeners or participants in the chat, for anyone who hasn't been to the centre, you really need to go. It's the most stunning landscape and so different to anything on either the east or the west southern areas of Australia. But yes, that extreme temperature shift is also a factor. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, we can go from, high 40s to -1. So
Yeah.
when we're talking extreme in our seasons, we go from really hot to then really cold. But we're seeing less and less now of the cold due to the climate change. We are seeing a
Mhm.
shift, and our houses and our accommodation isn't equipped to sustain the disasters that we're seeing that
Yeah.
are evolving over time.
And it's prolonged disaster as well. So
Mm.
when we're talking about extreme heat, we're talking about heat that's above 40, 45 degrees. I mean, the highest I've seen it get to, is 52 degrees.
Yeah.
But there's environments around Alice that will get even hotter than that. And then you coupled with that is housing that has not been designed to withstand extreme heat. And what Kay was talking about earlier with power cards, for example. So a lot of people may not know this, but in public housing in the Northern Territory, which the landlord for that is all the Northern Territory government, people have been placed on power cards. So you need to front load a power card in order for you to have any electricity at all. And then for families that are often running off very, very little, very minimum income, often they might only have $50 spare a fortnight that they can put on that. Now, when you've got overcrowding, and sometimes we're talking about more than 30 people in a house, in a 3-bedroom house, then that very quickly runs out. So when that goes out, then your fridge goes and all your food goes. There's also not enough to have air conditioning. You can see how in an environment like that there's a tendency for conflict. There can be. It just is another risk factor because you've got a lot of people in a very stressful situation with isolated with very limited resources. And for a lot of remote communities, there's one road in, there's one road out, and often that's an unsealed road as well. We see that be impacted by floods and things like that. Of course, the moment there's a little bit of rain, those roads get washed out and they can be very quickly totally impassable. So you have limited food coming in as well. So everything is much more expensive. And again, with families have such little income, you're really putting people in a really difficult position. It's very difficult to access services in an environment like that as well. But the other thing we see with that extreme heat as well is that our population is extremely transient, extremely mobile. It's normal for people to move between remote communities and regional centres like Alice. In extreme heat, the risk is that cars break down. There's no phone network coverage in those areas at all. People don't have water. People die and do die. And we've had a lot of tragedies where whole families have died travelling from their community into Alice to do food shopping, for example, because food is still more expensive in Alice than you'll find elsewhere, but is cheaper, considerably cheaper than remote communities. And we've had really disturbing forecasts come out, and the Central Land Council has been doing some amazing advocacy on this, where they're predicting that we'll be seeing, more than 4 months a year with temperatures above 35, 40 degrees in Central Australia. We, through human-driven climate change and disaster, we are seeing whole swaths of the Northern Territory become unlivable because of extreme heat.
Yeah. It certainly provides quite a stark reality to those of us who live in the southern areas of Australia. That's quite a different environment that you are living and working in. Before we go to what I'm interested to explore about the gendered results and consequences of that, do you want to share a little bit about the ecosystem destruction as well, and then we'll weave it together? I'm not sure which of you would like to actually dive into the whole bufflegrass discussion.
Well, it was interesting, wasn't it? Because I know we're going to talk more about this later, but we've done a little bit of work with Gender and Disaster Australia beforehand, and we ran some initial consultations with Aboriginal women here in Alice, and it was all about defining what disaster means here. Because yes, a lot of people will think fire and flood, whereas disaster here looks very differently. So we worked with people here to define what a climate-driven disaster looked like. Extreme heat came out very quickly, of course, but also so did bufflegrass. The introduction of invasive species and weeds in this case, which has resulted in total ecosystem destruction and collapse here. So we've got bufflegrass that's spread across like 70% of the Northern Territory. And when that happened, it took all of the wildflowers and all of the native plants and a lot of species that were dependent on those, took those with them. I don't want to be too fatalistic about that, because I've also seen amazing groups here like the Arid Land Centre and Landcare. I've seen them do amazing things removing buffle in areas, and I've seen the land spring back really quickly. So that's possible. But there's no denying the total ecosystem destruction that's come with buffle. And the thing about that is that the land is people's culture. It's their language. It's their song lines. So with the buffle didn't just take like native plants and wildflowers. It took people's dreaming. It took people's stories. It took people's totems. So that disaster was very real from a cultural and spiritual sense. And maybe Kay can talk to that more. But also an obvious thing around buffle is that it's tied to fire. It dries up very quickly, and then fire can just rip through this landscape. And because buffle will often nestle around quite large, trees that are hundreds of years old, gum trees, it will take those really ancient trees with them, which is really devastating for people here. And then from a practical sense, buffle makes the landscape really dangerous, not just in terms of fire, but because you can't see the ground. And I'll give you a practical example of that. One, we have lots of issues with snakes in the buffle, but two, obviously we lost Kumanjai little baby here in Alice only a couple of months ago, and that impacted, I can't tell you how much that impacted our whole community and continues to impact our whole community, who are really grieving. But when we were searching for that little girl, we were searching in bufflegrass that came up past my shoulders. I'm not tall by any means, but it made the search so into what was an incredibly hard thing to do. It made it so intensely difficult. And I just thought, is now the time that people really start to take bufflegrass seriously.
And
the conversation that we're having is it's not looked at as a disaster, and there's no plan for a disaster and how we can mitigate it. So yeah, it looks very different to what some of the issues does on like the East Coast.
Mm. And if any of the people listening to us now are like me, they're probably just Googling on another computer to get a look at buffel grass, and it's really important, Shay, when you say it's up to here, and it's extremely difficult to eradicate or remove. In fact, it's probably impossible to, yeah. So I'm interested to explore a little bit of that reference, Shay, that you made to the spiritual impact of that, and the cultural impact, because I think for non-Indigenous people, it's been a really important lesson for me to learn about how deeply some things are embedded in identity and in how we live in the world. So I'd be very interested in a little bit more information about how heat and how buffel grass and how the environment in particular, the physical, natural environment, um, is a part of life and culture and identity from a gendered lens or not.
Yeah. Kay, do you want to take that one to begin with?
Yeah, I guess for us, the land is everything. So before you're born, you're a part of the land. And then the song lines are passed down through generation into generation. And there's certain animals and certain totems that belong to you and your family only. So when you have something that starts growing like a fungus, and it covers like a part of your soul. It covers the song lines, and it's very hard to be able to maneuver in this world when you can't see your foundation, your ground, to be able to walk this earth. So for some, and except I'm not from the Northern Territory, so my song lines aren't from here, but you talk to the elders here and they're like, this is something that we haven't experienced. We haven't experienced this heat. We don't know how to navigate this, to be able to pass down to our new generation. So it's new learning to be able to pass down these songlines to the next generations when your totem or animal or your custom is no longer there. So how do you replace something that has been there and now isn't?
And there's stories of like old stories, that are about like groups moving from one community to the other over like, hundreds of kilometers.
Yeah.
A lot of remote communities in Alice, they're hundreds of kilometers apart. These are really extreme, vast distances we're talking about. And now you couldn't travel that the same way because of the extreme heat. But then also like with the buffel, all you have to do is look at Central Desert art, like dot painting, what people refer to as dot painting, comes from here. It comes from Central Australia, the Western Desert art movement. And a lot of those artworks are about the wildflowers, that's what they are. And they have all virtually disappeared. Like I'm born and raised here. When I was little, like that was common. There would be fields of wildflowers as far as the eye could see, like beautiful like billy buttons and fried egg daisies and like mullas and all sorts, just everywhere, right? And you don't see that anymore. It doesn't exist anymore. And so, like Kay said, when it comes to those elders passing down the knowledge, they're trying to pass down knowledge of something that doesn't exist anymore in a vastly changed environment. And it's heartbreaking. Even for non-Indigenous people, it's heartbreaking, but maybe not heartbreaking enough because we haven't done enough about it, and it's our bloody fault, and we need to address it.
Do either of you have, can you describe to all of us any particular gendered impacts, women, men, or LGBTIQA plus people? Are there any particular things that you want to highlight that are the impacts of this kind of disaster?
Yeah, I mean, like Kay can talk to this more, but and only to a certain extent, I suppose. But all songlines and that's all gendered. All those stories are gendered. There's women's ceremony and there's men's ceremony. So when you're talking about this destruction of totem and songline and ecosystems, it by its very nature it's gendered. Kay, did you want to add any more?
Yeah, and just because it's gendered doesn't mean one is more, um, what's the word?
Important.
One is not more superior than the other.
Mhm.
Um, we've all got a role, and the song lines also go down to the family roles and responsibilities and what they carry for that specific song line. So it's yeah. I don't know how to articulate it right now. Sorry, my brain's not working.
Mm.
It's um
There are certain
how do you-
people that are trusted with those stories, like they
correct.
carry this story.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's their role, that's their
yeah,
job. And there's some stories that are held by only one person. And
correct.
like men can't carry women's stories.
And
Mhm.
So
women can't carry
yeah.
men's. And yeah, so it's really hard when it becomes with climate change and how it
Mm.
is impacting. And it is at a rapid rate.
Mm. And
Yeah.
there's also very tangible physical impacts of this as well. So I know that, for example, extreme heat is linked to a lot of complications during pregnancy. For example, we see like perinatal death. We see like early labor. We also see low birth weight as well. That's a real impact of extreme heat.
Mm.
We also know that like women continue to be the predominant care takers of their families and caregivers. So in those situations where you're in a remote community and you're cut off, whether that's by extreme heat, whether that's by fire or flood or whatever, women have to continue to give care in an extremely isolated and extremely resource scarce landscape with very, very few services. In a lot of places, there is maybe police and maybe a clinic, and that's it. And a lot of places don't even have that. There's nothing,
Yep.
and there's no
Yep.
phone network coverage. So you can think about for women having to provide care in a situation like that, it becomes, threefold, fourfold, tenfold. The amount of work that they have to do. And of course, amongst all of this, we know the evidence is very clear that the risk of domestic family sexual violence increases in times like this, in times of isolation, in times of disaster, including extreme heat. And women are disproportionately impacted by that. So all of
Yeah.
this intersects, all of it is
Yeah.
related. And of course, it's gendered.
Yeah. Thank you. Um, I want to move to a nuance about that. We've chatted prior to this session about my acute awareness living in Ballarat that we had a particularly difficult time with three very high profile women who died at the hands of their partner or ex-partner, or in one case, a stranger, but nevertheless at the hands of men. And I was very conscious that at the same time, women in remote communities in the Northern Territory were also dying. And I'd like to talk briefly about the media and get your ideas and thoughts about this because everybody heard about Ballarat and our deaths, and nobody reported or heard about what was happening in remote Australia. And I've always felt really concerned about that. So I wonder if you have any insights or thoughts about why the audience might not know much of what you're saying or ever hear about it, and what we perhaps should do about that.
Structural racism, to just answer it very quickly. Like, I
Mhm.
mean, Um, there's a reason why people don't know about these things, and it's because it overwhelmingly impacts Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And these are Aboriginal people living in remote places. And it's also disproportionately impacting Aboriginal women.
Mm.
And so that is why it's not reported. Um, I did some work with media professionals across the Northern Territory in 2021 following the death of a close friend of mine, Ara Bunja. She was killed by her partner right at the start of 2021. And our experience with the media following that was awful. We had for days, weeks afterwards, there was no reporting. And this woman, she was a Ara Bunja. She was a prominent woman in our community. She was the president of her town camp. She was an advocate against family. She's a known woman, right?
Mm.
And they didn't report it for weeks afterwards. And we had to kind of walk through our lives in a world where everyone was pretending that there was nothing wrong, that nothing had happened. And then once it kind of got out, then we had a lot of really awful interactions with the media. We had some good ones too, but lots of invasive questions, lots of sharing, photos that without permission. And obviously photos are really sensitive of Aboriginal people who have passed, and sharing of her name, things like that, that were just a really awful experience. So with the Tangendura Women's Family Safety Group, we led a few consultations to develop some media guidelines for the reporting of domestic family sexual violence around the Northern Territory. And what we heard from Aboriginal women is that they really wanted these stories to be told, but they wanted them to be told in the right way, sensitively, because them going unreported made it feel like their lives didn't matter. And that is how it feels, like their lives are unimportant. They're not even a footnote in the national conversation. And they should be the national conversation, because we know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are disproportionately impacted by domestic violence and domestic violence homicides. And if we design something that works for Aboriginal women in remote communities, it will work for everyone, everywhere. But we also heard in those consultations from media is that they often don't report on these things because they believe that people on the East Coast won't read about them. They don't care about them. And in one of their words, like, they can't relate to an Aboriginal woman in a remote community. They can't see her as sufficiently human enough to grieve her the way that they might grieve women in other parts of the country. In that same period where those 3 women were killed in Ballarat, 3 women were killed also in Katherine in the Northern Territory. Ballarat's over 100,000 people. Katherine is 10,000 people. And in that same period, 3 women, all Aboriginal women, were also killed there. And there was no reporting. There was no social media campaigns. There was no huge injection of funds, in a Katherine approach. And look, I don't begrudge Ballarat those things, and I don't begrudge the reporting of those women who were killed there. That's what they deserved. That was right, and that was necessary. But all lives are important, and Aboriginal women's lives matter. And they should also be mourned by the nation the way that other women are, and they should be, at the very least, a catalyst for change, because that's all we can do for those women now, is try to use their stories to make things better for other women.
And I'm extremely hopeful that everyone online, even though we can't see you, that you're all nodding and agreeing that this situation needs to change. And even though I do live in Ballarat, I just wanted that on the record, that whole conversation about invisibility and inequity and injustice and, as you say, systemic racism, Chay. So I would like to ask you a sort of it's potentially a broad question, but clearly the systems that we like to think of as protecting and supporting all Australians aren't. And in some cases we as part of the system, we perpetuate harm, not necessarily intentionally at all. And I think you're very generous in how you've been describing that, both of you, in our conversations and today. But nevertheless, unintentional harm is still harm. So I'm interested in exploring what you both think about how we can not inadvertently reinforce this inequity or increase risks for women, as you've outlined, and what are some of the things that you think we should be considering to do about it? Because some of us will advocate, so let's explore what needs to change.
What do you think, Kay?
I think that we need to throw out everything, restart again. Each community know what they need, and no one wants to listen to the voices of the people that matter and who it affects. I think our current systems are so great of being such high level where there's no connection to grassroots. So plans that are put in place don't actually consider or mitigate any risks. I think they cause more harm sometimes. Chay?
Yeah, like I think I'm sorry, you can probably hear a car alarm going off outside, but look, we have systems set up, and I agree with what Kayla's saying. I think we often talk about system reform. I think we need to talk about system transformation, because all of these systems were set up And they come from a Western framework, they come from Western settings, and they're all set up to benefit largely non-Indigenous people over Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And these systems that we are told are protective and that we need to call upon for help when we're in danger. Well, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, they have not been protective, right? They've caused very real harm. We need to think about, for example, the stolen generations and the fact that that's ongoing. But then a disaster occurs, and then you're asking Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women to then place their trust in these same systems that have caused so much harm to them and their families, both in the past and now. It's the same with police. Like, we have the last documented state-sanctioned massacre of Aboriginal people here in the Northern Territories in 1928 at Coniston. Estimates of that's after Gallipoli and all the things that we're told to remember, but this we're told to forget. And estimates are up to 300 people were killed by police officers in that massacre. Now, that's within living memory. People remember that. I know people who were babies at that time who survived, right? And that pass on. So this living memory. So then we ask Aboriginal people, particularly in times of disaster, to then place their trust in police, in emergency services, in place like this, like that, and ask them to ignore the harm that's occurred.
Yeah. And then, we look at the intervention in the Northern Territory and the recommendations and what has happened and where we're at. Then, you look at the present with the current government trying to bring in new laws around child protection. These systems are designed, but they don't help my community.
Yeah, and so for people who don't know, the intervention is the Northern Territory Emergency Response that was rolled out in 2007 under the Howard government, but then continued under Rudd and Labor through Stronger Futures legislation. And what that required was them to suspend the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975 so that they could implement laws only for Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. And it was a suite of measures, and that included literally rolling the military into remote communities in the Northern Territory. There were reports of women hiding their kids in cupboards, things like that. Like, imagine the terror of that. So it was very punitive, it was very top down, no consultation, and lots of like missed opportunities in there. It did come with like an injection of funds, but there were things like, for example, they decided to try to put some safe houses in remote communities, and they put them in, and they're like, oh, during the evaluation, why isn't no one going to these safe houses? They found out they put the safe houses on men's ceremonial sites in some cases. So, just violence on top of violence on top of violence. So in this kind of setting where the impacts of that are very real and continuing, and the legislation Kay is referring to is legislation that was introduced after Kumanjaya little baby was killed, which will lower the threshold for child removal. It will make it easier for the permanent placement of Aboriginal children into group homes or with non-Indigenous carers. It will really dismantle the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle. We have real worries about this legislation that's being rushed through in the NT. So in this kind of legislative landscape, within this history of violence, then you chuck on top of that a climate-driven disaster and ask people to then have faith and trust in these systems and institutions that have caused so much harm. It's not fair.
I couldn't agree more, and I think it's a really important, this is possibly uncomfortable, this whole conversation, this part of the conversation for many people who are listening. And I encourage you to sit with the discomfort. We need to be really uncomfortable about what's been happening. I'm aware of a little bit of information about the Daly River flood evacuation, and I don't even know what to call it now. There's the housing options available and how unsuitable and unacceptable they are as well. So, I think we really do need to transform how we respond.
I think it's similar comparison between Ballarat and Catherine, to think of what's happened in the Daly to Lismore. I think all of Australians kind of know what happened in Lismore and like the impact of flood there. And how that community is still really struggling to recover from that. Well, it's been a similar situation for Daly River. Catherine's also had a really difficult wet season, a couple of floods within a couple of weeks of each other. And the recovery efforts are still ongoing. But I don't even know if you can characterize them as that, because also there's just been a lot of reports of like people not being able to access like emergency payments. A lot of the reporting around the behavior at evacuation centres by security guards has been horrifying, to be perfectly honest. So it's been a really when it comes to responding to remote communities, the response is always slower, and it is always with fewer resources and with far less attention.
Yep. I'm very conscious that I am watching the Q&A and I can see that no one has yet asked a question. So while everybody is completely captivated by everything that you are both sharing with us, I would like the audience to start to think about and put into the chat questions you'd like me to pose on your behalf so we can explore more. I'd like to shift gears though with our next planned question, and in no way to diminish everything you've said to date, I would like to shift to what some of the positive things are that are happening across the Northern Territory. So clearly there's systemic failure, and no question in my mind that there are things that need to change. And I hope that we can continue to work together, and I'll come to that in a moment about how we might change some of what you're describing. But I would like to say it'd be great to hear a few stories about what's happening where people are leading their own community preparation or response or recovery. And if you've got any examples of talking about how we can celebrate and amplify what's working, if anything is working, can you share some of that with us?
I think for me, seeing the Gallowinku Women's Space and the incredible work that they're doing with how little money that they have and the struggles that they have faced. They're probably one of the organizations that I think do incredible work. The Tangentyere Women's Safety Group are another that has been, oh, now Chay, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they've been going for like the last
12 years.
12 years. They started because we had such an extreme violence in the NT, and they started the group to see change. They seen that they had hope, I should say, that change could happen, and they have fought government. They have started grassroots is another amazing thing that they've done. Chay, is there any more that you can think of?
I mean, there's loads. Like you said, like no one in the Northern
CLC.
Territory is sitting around on their hands waiting to be saved. Like communities know what they need, and they just need to be supported with the resources to do it. Like when Kay and I did this early work, like consultation, speaking with Aboriginal women, Aboriginal women's groups around climate-driven disaster and how it intersects with violence against women and children, there was no shortage of ideas of what could be done. Really creative, really innovative ideas around what needed to happen, like that was culturally competent, responsive, and would work for people here. And that's the thing with a lot of this history and this ongoing story of intervention. It's very much stuff coming in from the outside and being imposed over remote communities, the people of the Northern Territory. And it often comes from this, benevolent thing of like, as a white savior complex essentially, but it's about we'll come in and we know best and we're the experts and we'll fix it. We've seen that endlessly. And it doesn't work. There's huge resistance to that, and often because people don't understand the context here, right? The best way to do it is to look at the people who are already there, who are doing the work, who are leaders in their community, and supporting them and elevating them and amplifying them, not some random that thinks that they have an idea that will work. The local expertise is here already. And like Central Land Council has been doing some amazing work in this space around climate. There's plenty of organizations and remote communities that, yeah, have lots of ideas about what they would like to do. They just need that support. And that goes for everything, I believe, like any place in the world. Something that's externally imposed that has little information from the ground or collaboration and local partners. I mean, it's doomed to fail, right? So
Yeah.
there is work that's underway, and there is a role for people from outside as well that they're very welcome in, which is a supportive role,
Yeah.
and a collaborative role in genuine partnership. So look at this wonderful work that's been undertaken by CLC, like Aboriginal women's groups around the NT.
MPY,
Sorry?
MPY, women's,
MPY,
yeah.
yeah, and really look at, well, how can I support you? How can I help you? How can I elevate what you're doing already?
Mm. Thank you. Agreed. Um, there are some questions coming in, so I might keep them coming, and I might just flick to them, and we'll see how we go. So I'm literally going to read this one. So very aware of the racism in the reporting of what goes on in the NT compared to the rest of Australia. And I share this with you, whoever has written this, just so stunned and devastated about the ecological disaster and how this is not widely known or looked on as an emergency. How can we in the southern states contribute to advocacy around all of what we've heard here today?
I think that's a great question.
Mm,
Thanks for that. I think one is education, like educate yourself and others around you. And then to look at the advocacy that's being done by those groups. I really encourage everyone to jump on CLC and look at the work that they've been doing, and Arid Lands as well, and also the NT Environment Centre. Jump on their socials, on their pages, and really elevate what they're doing. But share it with the people that you know. Like, you're all influential people.
mm,
You all have people in your sphere. Yeah, let them know what is happening here. Because we do welcome the support, that we want the support. We don't want people to talk over us, but we want people to like work alongside us.
mm.
We'd be, yeah, really grateful for that.
Anything to add to that, Kayla?
Shay's a brilliant speaker, so
We'll just sit here and nod.
I echo, yeah, I echo with what she's saying there.
Yeah,
We need more allies that can support us, but not to speak over us.
yeah. And thank you, Christine, for that question. Christine's now owned up to her posing that question. It's really interesting. Any of you who are now on Google and chasing all these leads up, try to stay with us in the moment of this webinar, because we're going to send you some links following the webinar to help you chase up some of this information. Um, I think now might actually be a good time to say we at Gender and Disaster Australia have actually been doing some work with her story, and we're very grateful for the work you did for us last year. And that's leading to us being right in the midst of discussions with a funder. And I hope, more than hope, I look forward to sharing more publicly that we will be doing some further work with her story, focused on bringing a First Nations gender lens to that intersect between gender and disaster that we advocate around. So we're very hopeful that some of this work we will now support your voices to be louder and clearer, and the voices of lots of Indigenous people across the northern part of Australia. So stay tuned for that. We're very, very excited, all of us, about working together on this. We really want to support you. I'll go to the next question, though. Keep them coming. Uh, this is always a fun question. Danny asks, what is one small thing that individuals can do today to help start shifting this narrative? I'm sitting here nodding along. I could feel it. I knew people are sitting here nodding along. Um, and I know we need more advocacy and to share Aboriginal voices. It feels unachievable looking at the bigger picture. It shouldn't be, but that's the reality of how it feels. So, are there small things? You've sort of answered this question a little bit, Shay. Are there small things other than maybe just um, speak up, ask the questions, learn more, share it with your friends and colleagues in your workplaces? Is there more that we can do?
Yeah, look, like we all have bias. all of us, right? And there's a lot of internal work that we need to do, particularly non-Indigenous people. Like we all are raised in this world, this society. You can't walk through water and not get wet, right? So there's a lot of internal work to do and to look for opportunities to elevate and amplify the voices of Aboriginal people, particularly Aboriginal people from remote places. And very importantly, from the places that are most impacted by the issues you're talking about, because that's the nature of intersectionality, right? Is that it's not just that people are Aboriginal people or women or living in a remote community. It's all of those things, the compounding, gendered, racial, and geographic disadvantage that goes into that particular experience. So that's who we really need to listen to, and that's who we need to start designing interventions around, because if it will work for them, it will work for everybody. So I think there's a bit of internal work that needs to happen. And I really encourage people not to feel hopeless. I actually believe that this work is incredibly and inherently hopeful because it's all preventable. We can do something about all of this, right? This is not out of our hands. This is in our hands. We can each do something. And I do think a lot of it is that education piece. And I do think a lot of it is about raising up the voices of Aboriginal people, particularly those most impacted by these issues that we're talking about. Because after the Voice referendum, where that voice was denied and all the Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory voted for it, that was so devastating for communities here, and Kay can talk about that more. And I think given that that has happened, then it's incumbent upon all non-Indigenous people to really look at opportunities for elevating those voices now.
It's important as well about holding government accountable for their work, and also needs-based funding. So we haven't spoke about it, but like in the Northern Territory, we work off a oily rag. There is no funding, and the amount of incredible work that is coming out of the NT it speaks volumes about how incredible people are here and how resistant. So I think we really need to look at where the funding's going, how it's being spent, and really advocating for the funds to be distributed fairly.
Yeah, and I think it's like, okay, if you're in a meeting where these decisions are being made, have a look around the room and look at who's there. And if it's all non-Indigenous people, point that out. And if it's all men, for example, point that out. Like, make sure that people are in these places where decisions are made and bring it up. Well, what about remote communities? Have we thought about remote communities? Like, have we thought? And if there's national conversations, is someone from the Northern Territory there? Because often they're not. So be like, okay, well, what about remote communities? What about the Northern Territory? I mean, really take it upon yourself, I think, to be that advocate.
And I think, with the Northern Territory, Central Australia and Top End have different needs because of the climate. So, when people say, oh, yeah, we've got someone here from the NT, well, where are they from? Is it the correct person? How are they, we've got a desert that is dry and heat, and then we've got Top End that faces floodings, and they also face extreme heat, but different type of heat and different type of needs. So I think, when you lump us into one group, we need to start pushing back more and saying, no, we need more representation of the different clusters.
I'm very aware that we also currently there is a consultation process open to inform the second National Action Plan to eliminate violence against women and children. And I know that we now do have, as a nation, a First Nations plan to eliminate violence. It's about making sure we constantly refer to both being essential, and that we constantly, those of us who have advocacy and influential connections and dare I say power and influence, we need to keep advocating for both, investment in both. So there you go. We all need to make a commitment to do more of that. I have a really interesting question from Millie. Are the audience able to share the sorts of things that you're both saying? Are you comfortable? This is such a useful set of insights. Are you comfortable if people name you and credit you and talk about this webinar? And I'm hoping I know the answer, but I'll just ask you. It's a good, courteous question to ask, Millie.
I think we'd be disappointed if they didn't. That's the whole point of doing things like this, right? is that we do want to shine a light on a lot of, we know that people outside the NT, people outside of Central Australia, we know that they often don't know about these things, that they're not hearing about them. It's not showing up in their social media feeds.
Yeah.
It's not showing up on, in their news channels. We know that, so we want to highlight it. And yeah, we hope that we walk away from any of these conversations with people feeling like they can be champions of change, for remote communities, for the NT.
Mm. And certainly you can share and show the recording of this webinar. This is a public-facing webinar. So anyone who's listening and watching, please feel free to show this in your teams or share it with colleagues. We're very, very happy to do that. This is one of the reasons why we at Gender and Disaster Australia want to shine a light by working more with both top end and centre, because we agree, Kayla, they're different environments. So look out for our work. If you're not already following us, please follow us, because you'll hear more about these conversations today and what we're going to be advocating for in the future. So I don't have any other questions coming from the floor, as it were. Feel free to pose a question. I am watching in case you do. Um, I've got another question about, you've covered a lot of the topics we had thought to explore with you, but I wonder if there are any particular things that you'd like emergency management professionals and practitioners to have on board in their minds, to know about. We've talked a little bit about evacuation. Are there particular things that you'd like some of our emergency management listeners to keep in the front of their mind?
Yeah, definitely. From me, I would like emergency personnel to be domestic violence informed. And I think we need a greater understanding that domestic violence doesn't stop in the context of disaster. In fact, it increases, right? So that impacts, for example, like evacuation centres, like when people have domestic violence orders in place or an apprehended violence order in place. Some of those are full non-contact. We've got stories of people, being placed in situations where there's only one bus out and they're both on there, and then having to live in the evacuation centre, often like for communities here, sometimes for months. And there's a full non-contact DVO in place, and there's a history of ongoing violence, and there's extreme risk there that's not being seen, that's not visible, and that's not being managed. There's also like real other gendered implications of that as well, like things being unsafe often for women and children in those environments. So I think really bringing a DV lens to your work is really important, being really aware of that. And I know that Gender and Disaster Australia does some training on that. So I think I'd really encourage that. And then the other part of it is about, it's really uncomfortable, right, for people who might, be police or work in healthcare or social workers or child protection, but there is this history, right, of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So that can be really uncomfortable for those of us who are in those professions. But we really need to learn about that and hold it so that we can be more understanding of the people that we work with, so that we can reflect and try to make our practice as safe as it possibly can be. So I'd also really encourage a lot of education in that area, whether that's undertaking cultural safety training, whether that's speaking with local ACOs and local elders and leaders about what's the right way of working with people, right? And not taking it personally when people are distrustful, of you. Like, they have every right to be, and because they're not seeing you, the person, they're seeing the system, a system that's caused a lot of harm. So I think being really aware of that and constantly reflecting on our practice and trying to do better.
I'll come to you, Kayla, I promise. It's so interesting that a colleague of mine whose judgment I value enormously once said to me, "Why should anyone, I trust you, Margaret. I know your heart is good. But why should anyone trust you to just say, yeah, let's partner with Margaret?" So building that relationship over time is so important, and having the self-awareness and the understanding in a non-Indigenous person that actually it's not about me, it's about a whole system of exclusion and racism and pain and trauma. And I just happened to be representative of that, even though I wasn't actively involved, and I just have to suck it up, really. And a lot of us have to suck it up and be prepared to do the hard work to earn, and it's not even that hard compared to what's happened before, just to earn that trust and build those relationships and take that time. Um, I agree. Kayla, did you want to add anything to that?
Think I just wanted to add to what Shay was saying also about like our sister girls and how our the evacuation centers are not set up. Or if they are, it's little as possible. When we talk about culture, sometimes we don't look at some family groups can't be in the same
Yep.
room as other family groups. So really understanding that dynamic.
Mm.
Because in the NT we don't even really have a disaster evacuation plan. So when we're talking about this, in the NT we're sort of unique. Well, we can look at it as a unique because it means we can build something that hasn't already been there. So that's just something I wanted to add. I don't know
Mm.
if you want to add some more, Shay.
I just think for the audience members who might not know, so sister girls is a term that some Aboriginal communities use to refer to trans women.
Mm.
And sister girls, as with brother boys as well, like there's a long history of their existence within these cultures, and they often have like their own like unique places within community and ceremony. But we also know, like with trans women around the country and around the world, that they do experience, higher rates of violence sometimes.
Mm.
So again, that's in the importance of bringing that gender and that DV lens to all of the work that we do, and it's really important in the context of climate-driven disaster because everything is heightened.
Yeah.
There is greater risk. There's the injection of risk factors, but also there's incredible pressure on whole communities and whole families. Like it's really important to hold all that.
Mm.
The other thing that we haven't spoken to, and I don't know whether if it's relevant, but I don't know, Shay, do you want to talk about how some of our waters are unsafe to drink in remote communities because of uranium and the cost around water
Yeah.
supply?
We could talk about this stuff endlessly. Probably another thing that a lot of people don't know is that we have real water issues in the Northern Territory, right? So a number of remote communities, their water has been poisoned because of the impacts of mining, and some communities, their water has been cut off by the Northern Territory government, and so now has to be trucked in. And that's usually trucked in by ACCOs at considerable expense, just so that people can continue to live. But then at the same time, we have a Northern Territory government that is very keen on fracking and very keen on like licensing water to be used for cotton industries and others. Like there's real worries around water. There's also been incredible advocacy around this that I really encourage you to look at. But all of this the huge social justice issues
Yeah.
that the rest of Australia is often totally ignorant to. Like imagine a town, imagine Sydney or Melbourne or one of the towns in Victoria, their water being poisoned by mining and no one knows about it. Like there's some communities that have like, you know, 10 times the safe recommended level of uranium in the water.
Mm.
I'm not sure what level is safe, to be perfectly honest, but and so water is undrinkable, and this is a desert.
Yeah.
So all I think the advocacy line is that a single drop of water is precious in the desert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
to the sickness that comes from it.
sorry.
And I was just saying, and the sickness and the
Yeah.
health implications that start from that also.
And it becomes another thing people have to buy, right? It's another
Yeah.
thing people then have to buy water, or water has to be trucked in. It becomes another thing that's impacting food security and people's health and safety. Yeah, I mean, we could talk endlessly about these things, about the fact that, housing, for example, in the Northern Territory, the emergency housing wait list is 10 years long in the Northern Territory. You know, there's often no safe place for people to go in these situations.
So as with most webinars, we are out of time as we are hitting our stride and so much to discuss, but we are out of time. So I feel a commitment to draw it all together. Let me say thank you both for the incredibly useful insights you've brought to us today. And again, I can see in my mind everybody nodding and clapping. It's been an incredibly useful webinar, and I thank you for participating in it, both of you. Thanks to the audience for coming along. There were a couple of questions I, in the end, didn't get to. I'd like to give a plug to one of the comments that Lisa has made. We can all expand our social media profiles and reach. We all live in bubbles. We all live in little bubbles on social media because of who we friend and like and follow. So I would encourage you to take some of the actions that Lisa has taken by following, you know, the NT Environment Centre or the CNC Arid Lands, Her Story. Feel free to just explore and follow some new perspectives as a way of opening up our minds. That's something we can all do. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming today. We're very excited to continue these conversations. And what I'd really like to ask you to do is please fill out the 1-minute feedback survey that will pop up on your systems as we're leaving the discussion today. It really helps us with our planning. Feel free to make suggestions, give us feedback. We are wide open. If you're not already a follower of ours on our website, just get on our mailing list and you'll get more and more information about what we do. As I mentioned earlier, we are super excited to be doing some more work with Her Story, which will be announced shortly. So that we can bring this perspective to the discussion of disaster resilience, and how gender intersects with all of that. So thank you all very, very much for coming today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next conversation.